excerpts from Leviticus. I mean, I get it, it's an important book, but I didn't quite see the deep dive material right away. But then I started digging into these specific chapters you flagged, the ones dealing with like unintentional sins and the offerings they had to make back then, and whoa, my mind was kind of blown.
I hear you. It's easy to dismiss this stuff as like ancient rituals, but there's some serious depth there.
Yeah, we're talking about like the whole idea of accountability,
Yeah.
messing up even if you didn't mean to, and how you try to make things right. I mean, that's a human experience that's like timeless.
Absolutely. These chapters are really wrestling with those fundamental questions like, what does it even mean to be responsible for your actions, especially when you didn't intend for something to go wrong? And how do you find some kind of reconciliation or peace after that? It's pretty profound when you think about it.
It really is. And like what's so interesting is they had this whole system for dealing with these oops moments, right? Not the stuff you do on purpose, but the things that just happen, even though they had real consequences. So just to give everyone a little roadmap of where we're going with this, we're going to be looking at some specific scenarios from Leviticus, like what happened if you knew something important but didn't speak up, or if you accidentally touched something considered unclean, which we'll get into what that meant. All those uh-oh moments.
Exactly. A whole spectrum of, I didn't mean for that to happen situations. But the thing is, within their framework, those moments weren't just ignored or brushed aside.
Not at all. Okay, so let's dive into that first category, right? These unintentional sins that required a sin offering. This is Leviticus chapter 5, verses 1 through 13, if anyone's following along. Now, when you look at those initial scenarios, what jumps out at you?
I think what's really fascinating right off the bat is how much weight they put on, well, failing to testify. Like if you knew something that was relevant to a public charge or accusation and you just kept quiet, that was a big deal. It wasn't just about, minding your own business. They saw it as a transgression.
That's interesting. So it wasn't just about actions, but also about inaction, like staying silent when you should have spoken up.
Exactly. And it highlights this societal expectation that, like, holding information, especially important information, carried a real responsibility. You had a duty to speak up. It really makes you think about the power of silence, even unintentional silence, and how much impact it can have.
It's funny you say that because you can see parallels to that even today. Think about situations where people might be hesitant to come forward with information, even when it's really important. Maybe they're afraid or just don't want to get involved. But this ancient text is like, nope, you have a responsibility here. So let's say someone realized, oh, shoot, I should have spoken up, or I didn't realize that was unclean, or I made that promise without really thinking. What did they have to do then?
Okay, so the first and absolutely crucial step was confession. The text is very clear on this. You had to acknowledge what you'd done wrong. That verbal recognition of guilt was key. And then came the offering. For these kinds of unintentional sins, the standard offering was a female lamb or goat.
So it wasn't just about saying, my bad. There was a physical action tied to it too. What was the significance of offering an animal like that?
Well, the sacrifice, which was performed by the priest, was seen as a way to make atonement for the person's sin. It was about ritually cleansing them and restoring their standing in the community and with God. A tangible representation of, acknowledging the wrong and seeking reconciliation.
I see, a physical act to go with the internal acknowledgement. Now, what about those who couldn't afford a whole lamb or goat? Was there any way for them to make things right?
That's a great question, and it actually speaks volumes about the values embedded in this whole system. The text specifically addresses what to do if someone was too poor to afford a lamb or a goat.
Oh, so they weren't just excluded.
No, not at all. If a lamb was out of reach, the text says they could bring 2 young pigeons or 2 turtle doves instead. The ritual is a bit different. One bird was for the sin offering, its head was wrung off, though not completely severed, and its blood sprinkled against the altar. The other bird was offered as a burnt offering.
So still a sacrifice, but adjusted to what someone could actually provide.
Exactly. They recognized that not everyone had the same needs, but that everyone should have a pathway to atonement. It's actually quite progressive when you think about it.
It really is. But, I mean, even 2 birds might have been a stretch for some people, right? What about the poorest of the poor? Were they just out of options?
This is where it gets really interesting. For those who couldn't even afford the birds, the offering was adjusted even further. They were to bring 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour. Now, an ephah was a dry measure, sort of like a basket, and a tenth of that was still a decent amount of flour, but far more attainable for someone in extreme poverty.
So from a lamb or goat down to a couple of birds and finally to just some flour.
Exactly. And get this, the flour was to be brought without olive oil or incense, because those were usually added to offerings that were more celebratory or voluntary. This was about necessity. A handful of the flour was burned on the altar as a memorial portion, and the rest went to the priest.
Wow, I mean, that really drives home the point that finding atonement wasn't about wealth or status. It was about recognizing you'd messed up, even if unintentionally, and participating in the process. Everyone had a path back.
I completely agree. It shows a system that was designed to be inclusive, making sure everyone had access to reconciliation, regardless of their economic situation. It's pretty remarkable.
It really is. And it seems like the key takeaway here is that even those actions or inactions, the things you did or didn't do without meaning any harm, they still had consequences, and there was a clear process for dealing with them. Accountability was built into the system.
Exactly. You couldn't just say, oops, my bad, and move on. There were steps to take, rituals to perform, to make things right.
Okay, so we've covered those unintentional sins that required a sin offering, but there's another category we need to talk about, right? The unintentional sins that required a guilt offering. This starts in Leviticus chapter 5, verse 14. What makes these different?
Right. So the guilt offering seems to be specifically dealing with situations where someone unintentionally did something wrong involving the Lord's holy things.
Holy things. That sounds serious.
It was. This could be things like accidentally misusing objects that were consecrated for religious purposes, or failing to give the proper tithes, or making a mistake in how you performed a ritual in the sanctuary.
So if you were supposed to use something in a specific way for a religious ceremony and you messed up, or if you accidentally broke a sacred object, that would fall under this category.
Precisely. And for these types of unintentional sins, the required offering was a ram without any defects, and it had to be properly valued in silver according to the standard they used in the sanctuary, called the sanctuary shekel. So we're talking about a more substantial offering than a couple of birds or some flour.
Right. A ram is a bigger deal. It seems to reflect that these offenses against what they considered holy were taken very seriously, even if they were accidental.
Absolutely. And there's another important element here that distinguishes the guilt offering from the sin offering.
Okay, what's that?
Restitution. It wasn't just about offering the ram. It was also about making things right in a practical sense.
So like paying for the damage.
Exactly. If someone had been unintentionally unfaithful regarding holy things, they not only had to bring the ram as a guilt offering, but they also had to make restitution for whatever they had failed to give or for any damage they had caused. And on top of that, they had to add an additional penalty of 1/5 of that value. This whole sum was then given to the priest.
Wow, so it wasn't just a symbolic act. They had to literally compensate for the transgression. That adds a whole other level to the idea of accountability.
It does. It emphasizes that even unintended actions could have real-world consequences, especially when they involve the sacred. And those consequences had to be addressed in a concrete way.
Makes sense. And that extra penalty, that 1/5 on top of the restitution, that really underscores how seriously they took these unintentional offenses against what they considered holy.
Absolutely. It wasn't a slap on the wrist. They understood that even accidents could have a ripple effect, especially in the realm of the sacred.
Now, the text also mentions another scenario that called for a guilt offering. Doing forbidden things unknowingly. Basically, you broke a rule but didn't even know it existed.
Right, and that's really interesting because it reinforces this idea that ignorance of the law wasn't an excuse. You were still accountable, even if you genuinely didn't know you were doing something wrong.
No getting out of it by saying, I didn't know.
Nope. In those cases, they still required a guilt offering, a ram of the proper value, to achieve atonement and forgiveness. It highlights that responsibility was tied to the act itself, even if the awareness wasn't there.
So to sum up the guilt offering, it was about those unintentional mistakes specifically against God or holy things. And it often involved not only a sacrifice, but also making things right financially and paying that additional penalty.
Exactly. And there's this really powerful concluding statement in this section of Leviticus. It is a guilt offering. They have been guilty of wrongdoing against the Lord. It really drives home the gravity of these offenses, even though they weren't intentional.
Okay, so we've gone deep into these specifics of unintentional sins and the different offerings. Now, let's zoom out a bit. What do you think are some of the key takeaways from all of this for our listeners today?
For me, what's most compelling is how nuanced their system of accountability was. It wasn't just a black and white judgment for every mistake. There were different categories, different requirements, even different scales of offerings based on what you did and your ability to make amends.
Right, like those sliding scales based on whether you could afford a lamb or birds or just flour.
Exactly. And the fact that confession was always the first step is also really significant. Admitting you did something wrong, even if you didn't mean to, was essential. And then the idea that there were multiple pathways to atonement, especially for those who didn't have much, shows that they truly valued the possibility of reconciliation for everyone. It wasn't just for the wealthy or the elite.
That's so interesting because it shows how this ancient text really grapples with the whole messiness of being human. We make mistakes, sometimes big ones, sometimes small ones, and figuring out how to deal with those mistakes, well, that's something we're still figuring out today.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, think about our legal and ethical systems today. They're vastly different in how they're structured, but the fundamental questions are still the same. When are we truly responsible for things we didn't intend to do? How do we make amends in a meaningful way? What does real accountability look like in our modern world? These aren't easy questions.
Not at all. And I think this whole discussion makes you wonder, do we have our own versions of these ancient rituals in a way? Like maybe our sincere apologies are like a form of confession. And when we try to fix something we broke, even if it was an accident, maybe that's our way of making restitution.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to look at it. Maybe our efforts to repair relationships after we've unintentionally hurt someone, that's our modern equivalent of those offerings they made back then. The human need to address wrongdoing and seek forgiveness, both from others and from ourselves. That seems to be a universal thing, regardless of time or culture.
It's fascinating to think about. So to bring it all back to those distinctions in Leviticus between the different types of unintentional sins and the specific ways to atone for them, I think it shows a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of human nature. They knew that not all mistakes are created equal, even when they're unintentional. They weren't trying to apply a one-size-fits-all approach to accountability.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They recognize the complexity of human error
Oh,
and the need for a system that could address that complexity.
yeah.
And it leaves us with a lot to ponder, doesn't it?
It really does.
Like, how can we create systems in our own lives, in our communities, even in our laws, that acknowledge the spectrum of human error? How can we provide pathways for people to take responsibility and find reconciliation when they mess up without resorting to, sacrificing animals? It's a challenge, but it's one worth thinking about.
It definitely is. Something to chew on long after we wrap up our deep dive today. Thanks for taking this journey with us.
Absolutely. It's been a fascinating one.